survivors don't have to wait until their life is at risk or something happens to them to report that abuse to law enforcement. Don't wait until something really awful happens to call law enforcement or get them involved. Just educate yourself, inform yourself, and make the best decision for you before it escalates to that level.
Welcome to Voices of Hope, a 4-part series where we explore the lived experiences of survivors navigating towards safety, hope, and healing with support from family justice centers and their partner agencies. Through honest conversations with survivors, advocates, attorneys, law enforcement, and youth program leaders, each episode reveals the transformative power of collaboration and the human stories that move us toward more effective services and support for survivors. From courtrooms and counseling rooms to campgrounds and police precincts, this series offers a rare window into what it truly means to support domestic and sexual violence survivors using a coordinated, trauma-informed, hope-centered approach. This podcast contains conversations about violence. The content may be difficult to hear, so please take care while listening. Hi, welcome to the final installment of Voices of Hope. Today, we're talking about the connection between survivors of abuse and law enforcement, where it works, where survivors may still face barriers, and what it takes to build real trust. I'm joined by Lisbeth, a survivor and advocate, and Bill, a domestic violence detective. We'll hear their experiences from both sides, Lisbeth's as someone who's lived it, and Bill's from his work in the field, sharing honest insights about safety, justice, and the challenges that still remain. All right, welcome back to Voices of Hope. Today we have Lisbeth Perez and Bill Hernandez joining us on our final episode. Lisbeth Perez is an advocate, author, and inspiring voice for survivors. Drawing from her own experience with intimate partner violence, she has spent over a decade advocating for the rights of immigrant survivors and their families. Her dedication has earned national recognition, including an invitation to the White House for the 30th anniversary of the Violence Against Women Act and the privilege of speaking in the U.S. Department of Justice in the Great Hall of the Robert F. Kennedy Building. Motivated by a deep sense of purpose, Lisbeth has ignited critical conversations around the need for inclusive, diverse, trauma-informed, and survivor-centered programs. She has shared this message at numerous conferences, including the annual International Family Justice Center Conference. Her advocacy has also been highlighted at the National Conference of Justice Centers for Women convened by the Government of Mexico. And Bill Hernandez is a domestic violence detective with the Napa Police Department and a nationally recognized expert in intimate partner violence and strangulation investigations. With over 27 years in law enforcement, Bill has led innovative, survivor-centered approaches to domestic violence response and co-founded the Monarch Justice Center, a family justice center serving victims of abuse and exploitation in Napa County. He has collaborated with the California District Attorneys Association, POST, and the Alliance for Hope International to develop training and protocols adopted across the state. And today we are going to talk about the role law enforcement has in a survivor's journey of escape and recovery. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. Well, Lisbeth, I want to start with you. As much as you feel comfortable with, can you share your own personal story of leaving an abusive partner?
Yes, and thank you for asking that question. In my journey as a survivor, I got into this abusive relationship very young. I was 15 years old when I started dating my abuser, and I was an undocumented young individual. And my abuser was only a year older than me, but he was documented and, of course, had a little bit more cultural privilege as well. So initially, as a young individual, and being with this person, dating for about 3 years, he was basically my Prince Charming and the love of my life. And I think that love and that hope kept me in that relationship for many years. And during our 7-year being together and then married, we had 3 beautiful children. And I think that love and that hope and the fact that we had children together and the cultural normalization of abuse kept me in this relationship for many years. However, through the years, that love and that hope turned into fear. The abuse escalated. He had issues with substance use, and then got involved into drug dealing and a firearm dealing too. So it was pretty scary to do anything. I was completely frightened. I didn't know anything about rights for victims of domestic violence. And of course, as an immigrant person, having no status, contacting law enforcement was also not a safe option for me. That was basically how I can summarize the transition of my relationship. And, when I'm asked this question of leaving my abuser, there's always like, well, you can just leave your abuser, but it's just not that simple. And also coming to the fact that this is a family member, this is your husband, this is the father of your children. That's just layer after layer of many reasons why I didn't leave. But absolutely, towards the end of the relationship, fear was the main reason for staying.
Yeah. And I feel like so many survivors can relate to that because, it's a shame that survivors still have to justify why they stayed for whatever length they did, whether it was a week or a month or 10 years, and we question abusers less on why they chose to abuse for that long. And I think that your reason of having hope and having love is probably going to resonate with a lot of people who are listening, because honestly, as much as women put up with in terms of either bad relationships or abusive relationships, isn't the ultimate thing that you want that person to just stop abusing you, because you want to stay, in most cases, a family. You want it to go back to how it was, the Prince Charming days, like you said.
Exactly. And it's really difficult because each experience is very different. Each survivor, their experience is very different. And that just speaks to your humanity as a survivor, that you have that love and that hope. And you just want that person not only to go back to being Prince Charming, but at the same time, you make this persona in your mind that you wish that person was as a husband and also as the father of your children.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's just a hope and
right.
a dream.
Yeah, it's not reality, and it's not the truth, because you might see little glimpses of that. A lot of survivors see little glimpses of this person that they wished their partner would be all the time. And so they think, well, it's still, that person is still there. Maybe they'll come back permanently. But unfortunately, it's just, as you well know, not how abusers work. So what was the final straw that really pushed you to get away from your husband and find outside support?
As I mentioned previously, his substance use got worse and the abuse escalated. And the fact that there were also firearms involved at home, that he was, selling and reselling, and in that whole dynamic, being involved with other dangerous individuals, so the threats escalated too. But one of the things that was the most painful and hurtful for me was my 6-year-old son was imitating his behavior. As he saw his father treating me, he started to treat his little sisters. And I just was, that was a really big eye-opening for me. This is not okay. I don't want this for my children. I don't want my son to grow being like his father. I don't want my daughters to normalize abuse as I did. And that was a big motivation for me to put an end to that situation and to actually have the courage to leave. And another important part of that decision was my family. And I tried to hide the abuse as much as possible from family and friends. But of course, my parents knew what was happening, and he isolated me for a period of time from my parents, and that was a big red flag for them. So one day they just showed up home and they wanted to have a conversation with me. And they basically opened that conversation of, we know what is going on. And if you decide to leave, we're going to be here for you. We don't want this for you and the kids. You don't deserve this. But just know that we're here for you. And that was just a life changer for me too. Because they removed the shame, they removed the judgment that it was in my mind, of being afraid to share what was going on with my family or friends. So I didn't feel isolated, I didn't feel alone. And that, of course, helped me to have a little bit more courage to leave that situation.
I can imagine. Yeah. And how many years has it been now since you've been away?
15 years. It's going to be almost 15 years.
Awesome.
It's been a while.
Congrats.
Thank you so much. But at the same time, when there's the substance use and firearms and other kind of like criminal activity involved with your abuser, you don't just fear for your safety and your life. You also fear for those close to you that might be able to help you. And that was a big fear that I had, but I just had to trust that everything was going to be okay. So it was one thing or the other. So it was just the fear from my abuser and also the fear to report to law enforcement.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, it's not like once you make that decision to leave, you're instantly safe by any means. It's sort of, I mean, we all know that that's notoriously the most dangerous time for a survivor of abuse is when they leave. So to have the courage to do that is no small feat. And that's why we need to stop telling survivors just to leave, because that's not an easy decision. It's a really dangerous one. And also having firearms in the house. We know that increases a survivor's risk of homicide by 500%. So that's no small number either. So Bill, let's go over to you for a second. Being our law enforcement spokesperson. Like Lisbeth had mentioned, she didn't feel safe calling the police. And for survivors, regardless of circumstances or immigration status, a lot of them feel like they have a hard time trusting law enforcement. So what would you tell other law enforcement ways that they could help build trust with those survivors so that they might be able to reach out for help?
So first off, I'd like to say, Elizabeth, thank you very much for sharing that story or your story with us. I think that your story has a powerful message behind it, and especially for law enforcement officers to hear. And it's a message and a story that I've heard multiple times from other survivors as well. Their fear of reporting to law enforcement because of either immigration status or prior negative interaction with law enforcement, especially if they were arrested when they were actually the victim previously. So I appreciate you sharing that information with us. Amanda, to get back to your question, as far as like ways that law enforcement can help survivors actually begin trusting us, is that we need to really slow down and listen to survivors when they're speaking. We need to understand that survivors are often navigating fear, trauma, and certainly uncertainty, and all of these things at once, while also managing their emotions and attachments to the abuser, and concern for their own children and their own welfare at that point in time. There's a lot of variables that are going on at that point in time, and once we understand that it's not just a you should leave and be able to walk away, that there's a lot of reasons and attachments why survivors stay or go back, it's easier for us to understand why they're in that situation that they're in. We can also help by thoroughly documenting the incidents when they're reported to us. I mean, do a good job, do your job, and it, thoroughly investigate the case and document it, and make sure that you're making appropriate referrals to agencies that can assist these survivors, throughout their situation, and follow up and be consistent. Every single time that you come in contact with a survivor, be consistent in your response, and be professional and be patient. A lot of survivors are going through a lot, and they're dealing with a lot of emotions and a lot of reasons that they're staying there. Our job is to meet them where they are and not where we think they should be.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of survivors are afraid that when they call the police, that their abusive partner will reverse that blame and accuse them of being the abusive ones and call out maybe injuries that they have gotten because the survivor was trying to defend herself as the survivor actually being the abusive one. Is that something that you've seen or heard of a lot? And what would you tell a survivor who was afraid of that scenario happening?
So it is something that we see often in law enforcement because, I mean, we arrive to the scene. Survivors are typically emotional. They've just been abused by a person that they love and they're attached to, and the suspect is often calm and in control. And then they try to ingratiate themselves with us, and they'll point at the survivor and go, "Oh, that look, that emotional mess over there. That's what I'm constantly dealing with. Do you see why? Do you see why you're called out tonight?" And they'll often point out, injuries on themselves and say that they were caused by the survivor, or they'll point to injuries that are on the survivor and say, "Oh, they cause those injuries to themselves." And sometimes that's true. It's like, especially in a case of strangulation, the survivor will be scratching their own neck to try to get either the ligature or hands of the suspect off their neck. Um, and in other cases, you've got defensive injuries on the suspect where this victim is trying to scratch and claw the victim to get them off them, and causing these types of injuries. So we need to recognize what are defensive injuries and what are offensive injuries, and then really listen to the entirety or the totality of the circumstances so that we understand exactly what happened and why things happened the way they were, and then take into self-defense. I would tell survivors that officers are now receiving extensive training in determining primary aggressor in these types of situations, and they're supposed to take into account a lot of other variables, and other than just who has a visible injury and who doesn't have a visible injury, and who has the most significant injury at the scene.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully getting a history, right, of an incidents, because I just from hearing from survivors, that's something that seems to be missed a lot by law enforcement. And I don't know if that is a lack of training or like a lack of patience to kind of get the history of it, but they fail a lot of times to ask, has this happened before, instead of treating it like this is a brand new incident,
Right, and that's something that our officers here in Napa are very well versed in doing, especially since we use a lethality assessment. We
Yeah.
obtain previous incidents, like, okay, how many incidents have happened previously, and that's one of our questions. And how many of these incidents were documented? And then when that case comes across my desk, I'm contacting that survivor later on for follow-up interviews to get to fully document those incidents.
Good. Awesome. That's great to hear. Doing it right in Napa. Lisbeth, were you ever nervous during your journey to engage with law enforcement? And what made you feel safe eventually to work with them?
Yes, I was nervous, but mostly afraid. I was very afraid, again, as I mentioned before, to report to law enforcement what was going on. There was so much fear for deportation, for having my kids removed from me. However, my first interaction with the officer was very, I wouldn't say friendly, but it was not intense. The officer was very understanding of the situation, and he had more like a conversation with me versus like asking invasive questions.
Mm.
And that absolutely helped de-escalate my fear and anxiety to talk to him. However, I do have to mention that, and I know Mr. Hernandez can agree on this, many times when it's the first time for a person to report the abuse, we try to minimize the abuse and somehow protect the other individual. However, this specific officer that I got, fortunate to interact with, it seemed very well trained. So when I showed the messages, the evidence that I had, he immediately knew it was a high risk situation, even though I was minimizing it myself. So when I reported the incident to this officer, one of the things that made me feel that he truly cared about my safety was giving me information about resources for people going through these type of situations. And he recommended me to go the following day immediately to the Family Justice Center here in San Diego to file a restraining order for my protection. And he documented everything. And of course, I did exactly what he told me to do because he made me feel safe to do so. So that was my first interaction. And the following day, when I went to the Family Justice Center, I was welcomed by a wonderful volunteer advocate. I was terrified to go because I didn't know what to expect. And
had you ever heard of family justice centers before this?
Never. It was my first time. I didn't even know what a family justice center was. I didn't know it even existed. I did not have any knowledge of what was a restraining order. The officer was put it in very simple words. That's just to protect you and your children from this individual to harm you, which I really appreciated because English, it is my second language. And, officers, law enforcement has like these different terms that for people, English not being their first language is very difficult to understand. And we don't ask because we're just afraid to ask or embarrassed to ask. What does that mean? And what is going to happen? So again, going back to my visit to the Family Justice Center, they had the San Diego Police Department unit there at the center. So I was immediately connected to the detective assigned to my case. My abuser had some kind of background with criminal activity. So when I met with the detective, he was bilingual and he was very kind, but at the same time firm. When I met with him, I would say he came with a bunch of folders with a lot of documents. And he just told me, I know what is going on. However, I want to hear it from you. And I was like, okay, he knows everything that's been going on with my abuser. So I still didn't feel comfortable. I still somehow felt bad to say a lot of things about my abuser because I didn't want to hurt him. But again, my detective was very patient with me. It was like a 2-hour conversation with him with a lot of tears. And he basically told me the same things the officer said. We care about your safety and we're going to help you obtain this restraining order. However, most likely this person is going to try to hurt you once this restraining order is served. So we're going to help you find a shelter so you're in a safe place with your children before he gets served. And again, at the time, I didn't have 100% understanding of what was happening. But all that I remember was they care about my safety and I'm going to be okay with my children. So they're not going to take my children or I'm not going to get deported. And
did your immigration status ever come up in the conversation?
Not at that moment. It was more in my internal fear, but they never asked me about my status. But I was just always afraid that they were going to ask about it. But it didn't come in the conversation, not my initial conversations with the officer or the detective assigned to my case. It was more them caring about my safety and gathering as much evidence possible. So again, I always say I believe that the detective truly saved my life because I didn't believe everything that he was telling me. Like his assumptions of what were the possible outcomes after that restraining was served, I didn't really process it. I thought it was too much, but whatever he told me was going to happen is exactly what happened. As soon as that restraining order was served to my abuser, he started looking for me everywhere, harassing my family, my past workplace, and it was just really scary. So I am very thankful for my detective for really caring for my safety and planned everything to make sure that I was in a safe space with my kids, and to avoid my abuser to harm me or, potentially try to take my kids from me.
Wow, that's terrifying. I'm so glad that you made it through that safely.
Thank you.
I trust that he eventually was arrested for his crimes. Hopefully.
Yes. So at the restraining order hearing, he didn't appear. So the judge immediately granted me a 5-year restraining order, permanent restraining order. Again, giving me full custody of my kids. But again, all of this happened with me really understanding what was exactly happening. I was just going by what it was recommended by, all the individuals involved in that process, from the officer, the detective, the advocate, psychologist, everyone involved. Everyone was just very kind and caring. So that made me feel safe to trust them. And eventually, a few months after, he was caught in the border of San Isidro and Tijuana trying to smuggle in drugs, and he was arrested for that offense. And once, he was in jail, they were able to add the charges for domestic violence, stalking. So that really helped my case make it much easier. And Mr. Hernandez can, share other cases that I'm sure don't go as easy, but that really helped to also, believe what I was telling them.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because like I said, when I was questioning, hopefully he's in jail, or hopefully he was held accountable, because not all abusers are. And I think that's another broad misconception of the legal system when it comes to abuse, is that it's illegal, so they'll be held accountable. And it fortunately doesn't always work that way.
It doesn't work that way. And, fortunately, again, he was arrested. He had multiple criminal charges apart from domestic violence charges. And eventually he accepted a deal, and he accepted his deportation instead of making time in jail. So he was deported a few months after.
Bill, in your opinion, do most law enforcement officers receive enough training regarding domestic violence survivors and how to speak to them, handle their cases, etc.?
So I would say predominantly no, not yet. I think there's a real willingness to try to do better. But many officers only receive the basic training either in the academy or maybe from their field training officer about domestic violence, sex assault, and it's often early on in their careers. And unless they take the initiative to receive additional training throughout their career, they're only going to probably get like a 2-hour update on domestic violence every other year, which is part of post mandate. I will say that as part of our onboarding here at the Napa Police Department, officers spend an all-day training with me, and it's a very intense and very, just long training about like where you fit at in this whole legal system. So I have about 2 hours on domestic violence, 2 hours on strangulation, about an hour on staged homicides. And then I also bring in advocates to talk about why it's important to call advocates. I bring in victim witness advocates as well to talk about what their role in the system is. I bring in district attorneys, probation, and child welfare so that they understand why it's important to not only do referrals to these agencies, but why it's important to do a full investigation so that each agency can do what they need to do to make sure that not only is the survivor safe, but the suspect receives consequences for their actions. So training is not always what officers get at the beginning of their career. I mean, extensive training in this field isn't always what officers get, but it's something that needs to happen more often.
I mean, the training that you just described that your officers get sounds very comprehensive, covering all sorts of facets of domestic violence. Why do you think that that's not happening across the board in every police district?
Well, because often agencies don't have people that have that type of training themselves in order to provide it to other officers. It's extensive training that I received through the Alliance for Hope International, training students strangulation prevention, California District Association, all these other organizations where I've gone to these trainings so that I can teach others about it. That's also expensive and it's time consuming. Usually an onboarding process for domestic violence is about an hour, maybe 2 hours at the most. But I've been able to negotiate with our police department saying, hey, we need more. And luckily, with my experience and my influence, I was able to get a full day of training.
Good. Well, we need more people like you to advocate for all of the police departments around the country. If anyone is listening that is in such a position, hint, hint. Elizabeth, what advice would you give a survivor who wants or needs to engage with law enforcement? What have you learned through your journey that might be helpful to them?
Yes, I would recommend survivors who are afraid to interact with law enforcement to call or contact an advocate, someone who specializes in domestic violence, who is aware, who is educated about the system, about the resources available, because that really helps individuals to understand the system and the processes and the possible outcomes when you report the abuse to law enforcement. And I always say, survivors deserve to make an informed and educated decision before it escalates to a really, awful incident. That's just part of the prevention, right? Survivors don't have to wait until their life is at risk or actually something happens to them to report the abuse to law enforcement. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're trying to do. Or me, myself, as a survivor and advocate, is just trying to inform and educate people. Don't wait until something really awful happens to call law enforcement or get them involved. Just educate yourself, inform yourself, and make the best decision for you before it escalates to that level. And of course, if they're in a very dangerous situation, to not hesitate to call 911, an emergency number in their area. But it's really important for people in general to educate themselves about domestic violence and the resources available and their rights, especially for those individuals like Mr. Hernandez shared initially, who had really bad experiences in the past with law enforcement or have, fear for deportation. To just, ask questions to those agencies and family justice centers with those experts in the topic. Because, especially culturally in the Latino community, other cultures, we go to our friends or we go to our neighbors or we go to our families, and they might have the best intentions for us. They might want to help us, but the reality is that they don't know themselves many times about the process and the system. So it's really important to, have them support you when you make that call, but to really contact someone who specifically works in the domestic violence field.
Mm-hmm. So important to build that pattern and to show that pattern of abuse so that when, unfortunately, if a broader violent incident happens, you have that history to show that this wasn't just a one-time thing. I also know that there's a certain number of survivors who don't realize that they can call a domestic violence shelter to speak to an advocate without needing to seek shelter. I think there's a misconception there that If you call a shelter, you're only calling because you want to escape, you want to leave, you want to seek shelter. And that's not the case. You can speak to an advocate at any time about any facet of domestic violence, no matter where you are in that process of leaving. What advice might you give, Lisbeth, to law enforcement? Anything that they might want to know from you about how they could better serve survivors or better understand their experiences? Or what do you wish they knew about trauma and abuse in general?
Yes. Again, I was a very fortunate survivor who interacted with trauma-informed, trained individuals in when I reported my abuse. However, now as an advocate, I know that's not the case for all individuals. And I just want to first say thank you to all the officers and detectives who works on these situations, because I know it can be pretty intense. But when it comes to individuals whose language is not English their primary language, to really be a little bit more patient with them, to use translation services, or maybe contact another colleague who speaks the language to really get the correct story from the survivor. I think that's really important. And also to use simple language. So the survivor, they're in a traumatic, probably shock event at that moment. So they might not grasp all that information. So don't expect the survivor to remember everything. It might take a little bit of time to mention everything that happened. And if you create that safe space, most likely the survivor is going to be able to tell you a little bit more. But before anything, just create that safe space, not only physically for the survivor, but also emotionally and mentally. Also, there's a lot of, survivors of the community itself, they don't really understand that when there's strangulation, especially, or a sexual abuse, or rape within the relationship, they have the right to get a domestic assault forensic examination or a sexual assault response team involved to really make sure that they are okay physically wise, and that it's important to also share, we care about your health, we care about your well-being, and this is available, and we recommend it just to make sure that you're okay. And again, language is really important. To communicate and to really let them know that they care about them, because that creates safety. But yes, as Bill said, in many agencies, they don't have much training. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. The officers, don't have this training, or don't really understand that probably that survivor, this incident is happening, but it's just one incident of potentially many incidents that happened in the past. So they're not only dealing with that incident, they're probably also reliving multiple incidents in the past, which, it might create a moment of just a crisis response, and just, again, be a little bit patient with survivors.
Yeah. I'd like to say that that's great advice to law enforcement officers, Lisbeth, and I hope everybody hears and understands what you're saying and follows that. I would like to add that when I do train officers, one of the first things that I have in every single one of my presentations is be the cop you would want to show up. And that's not just good advice for law enforcement. That's good advice for anybody responding to survivors in a crisis. Whether you're an advocate, medical professional, first responder, ask yourself, would you want you to show up if this call involved your sister or, your favorite family member, or your best friend, or maybe even your own child? I also remind officers that just because a survivor's story may not seem like a big deal to you at that point in time, it is the most important thing that they have going on in their life at that point in time, and you need to be present for them during that point in time. We need to build trust and help them to get it back. So I just think it's it's really good advice for officers just to follow that mantra. Just be that cop that you would want to show up if it was somebody that you cared about.
I love that.
Yeah. And lastly, I just want to add to that is that they don't have to do everything. There's, family justice centers in multiple places that they can rely on for additional resources and services to survivors, and just to connect with those agencies and in their communities who work specifically with survivors, just to make that connection and that warm handoff for that survivor to receive additional services to help them overcome that situation, whether it's a restraining order, whether it's a shelter, anything that they might need, again, to just be able to have those basic needs while they're going through such a difficult, scary situation. So, yes.
And I'm glad you were able to get those services at a family justice center during your initial encounter with law enforcement, Elizabeth, and encountering that detective who, didn't even ask about immigration status. And, oftentimes when I come into contact with survivors who are concerned about their immigration status, I let them know right at the get-go, like, hey, I really don't care. I'm here to listen to you and hear what happened to you and help you out the best way that I can. So that kind of relieves that stress from that point in time. And then being in a comfortable environment also relieves a lot of that. And you'd also said something earlier about, officers taking the time to explain things. I think that's really vital when we're communicating with survivors that, especially at the scene when they're going through this traumatic experience, to take our time and explain things. Because if you say, hey, do you want an advocate? They're not going to necessarily know what an advocate is. We're lucky enough in our community to have advocates that can respond 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to the scene to provide immediate advocacy. But if we don't tell them, hey, they'd like to come here and actually help you throughout this entire situation and explain things, people are going to be more willing to accept that help. Or if you say, hey, you want a restraining order, people don't understand what a restraining order is. And they think it's going to permanently keep, their loved one away from them for a long time. But it's, no, at this time, it's only a 5-day protective order, and explain those types of things. So I'm glad the officers did that for you at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And also the officers might encounter an individual who's just not ready to report or is not willing to share anything. That's okay too. They can still provide resources and services at family justice centers or another community, a nonprofit that specifically works with survivors, because survivors really don't need a police report to receive advocacy, to receive support, to receive resources. So that's also really important for them to know, for a lot of survivors themselves, because there's this, I see as an advocate myself, many times survivors believe that they need to report to law enforcement in order to receive support or information, which is not true. We're here to support anyone, regardless of on whether they're ready to report or not report. But again, mostly being able to provide that, not only that physical safety, but that emotional and mental safety for themselves and their children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are all excellent points. And we should also add, too, that one's immigration status should not stand in any survivor's way of receiving advocacy services, support, law enforcement support, criminal justice support, anything like that. Because regardless of status, survivors have a right to be protected against violence. So besides building trust between law enforcement and survivors, Bill, law enforcement also needs to build trust with advocates and advocacy services, who also sometimes fall into the category of not always fully trusting that law enforcement will have the best intentions of the survivor in mind. So how do you think family justice centers help to kind of build that bridge between law enforcement and other professionals within the DV world?
So prior to working in a family justice center and helping create Monarch Justice Center, I definitely saw that as a point in contention. The advocates weren't always trusting that officers were going to do the right thing, that they didn't have the best interest of the survivor in mind. But now that I'm working in a family justice center, it really changes everything. Working in a co-located collaborative with other professionals and advocates, so that they can see my work ethic, so that they can see how I work with survivors, so that I can provide immediate referrals for services when I'm at the scene. And every single interview that I do, follow-up interview, I don't even ask hey, can I have an advocate present with you during this interview? I ask, is it okay if I have an advocate present for you to support you during our conversation? Because it's going to be much easier for a survivor to say yes to get those types of services if I'm asking it that way, as opposed to, do you want an advocate not explaining what they're doing?
Mm-hmm.
I'll even say that there have been times when I've been interviewing a survivor at my family justice center, and this was probably about a year ago. The victim started crying and shaking and was hysterical. I stopped the interview, and I was lucky enough to walk down the hall, get a crisis therapist, counselor, and then bring them into the interview room, turn off the recording system, and then let them have a session. And then we rescheduled my interview for the following week. Because when you actually show that you care about people and that you have their best interests in mind, they're going to be more willing to get the help that they need, and may even be more willing to participate in the criminal justice system if they know you've got their best interests in mind. And just having that support. And I think showing that has really helped build trust with not only advocates at the Family Justice Center, but all the other professionals that work out of here.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, did you have anything else, Lisbeth, that you want to say?
Yeah, I just want to go back to what Mr. Hernandez was saying, like humanizing the situation, because, as first responders, officers, detectives, they deal with this type of situations all the time, right? So sometimes, and please correct me, Mr. Hernandez, if I'm wrong, but you numb in the work when you do it for a long period of time. But we just have to go back to our humanity and think about this is not only a traumatizing experience for a person, it's just a life-changing experience. And when you have that, if you are the first person that a survivor is interacting with and that they're reporting to, you are the person that can define whether that person feels safe to seek support and probably save their lives, or you're the person who actually, disappoints that person and doesn't feel safe seeking support anymore and go back to their abuser or try to escape themselves and probably lose their lives. So it's not just a survivor whether they want to leave that abusive relationship. It's about you're saving a person's life, and if there's children involved, you're also saving their lives and also their future. Because if a survivor goes back to their abusers and there's children involved, you're also, having to have that family, repeat the cycle and most likely have those individuals being abusers or victims in the future. And that's what we're trying to prevent. And as, again, you're that person who makes that important life-saving decision for that person. So your words matter, your work matters, not only for that moment, but to keep our families and our community safe, and again, to save lives.
Mm-hmm. That's a great note to end on, Lisbeth. And I will just copy your words and say that your work matters, and Bill, your work matters. And thank you so much for everything that you guys do for survivors. And thank you for coming on today to talk a little bit about that and for sharing your story, Lisbeth, because I know that cannot be easy to reshare that. So thank you again, both for what you do and for coming on today.
Thank you, Amanda.
You're welcome. Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by the Family Justice Center Alliance, a program of Alliance for Hope International. To locate a Family Justice Center near you, visit allianceforhope.org. Voices of Hope is hosted by me, Amanda Kippert, and edited by Produce Your Podcast, which can be found at produceyourpodcast.com. This podcast is supported by the Office on Violence Against Women through the U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the views of the U.S. Department of Justice or the Office on Violence Against Women. Whether you're experiencing abuse, questioning a relationship, or looking to learn more about domestic violence, you can find information, resources, and support, and search for advocates in your area at domesticshelters.org.